Tonight, the Supreme Court, a conversation with a woman at the center of one of America's most important institutions. As a moderate conservative, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor tips the scales on some of the most important issues facing the court. It is currently looking into school vouchers, the death penalty for mentally handicapped individuals, and other issues. Justice O'Connor's decision will weigh heavily in all cases. Her new memoir, Lazy Bee, reveals how growing up on an Arizona cattle ranch prepared her to become the first woman on the nation's highest court. I spoke with her at the 92nd Street Y here in New York, and here is what she had to say. Why write this book about growing up in the Southwest?
I wrote it with my brother because the ranch was sold in the mid-1990s. It had been in the family for 113 years, and I had thought it would always be there. It was this place where all of us could go, and we were always welcome there, and it was a sanctuary. We knew just what it was and just how it would be and all the people there, and I assumed that would be there for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and on through the generations. And when it was sold, it was devastating to me, and for some years I couldn't even bring myself to think about it. I had to block it out. And finally my brother and I had a discussion and thought we would try to put down some of those memories on paper. We weren't sure whether it would warrant publication. That wasn't our objective, but that's why it came about.
And you decided to do it with him?
Yes, because my brother, who's much younger than I, spent his whole adult life working on the Lazy Bee Ranch. After he got out of the University of Arizona, he married and he returned to the ranch and worked there until it was sold. And he had a great many more institutional memories of the place than I did because I went away to school from kindergarten on, and I was there summers and holidays and Christmas and Easter, but didn't spend all of my time there as he did.
What are your first memories?
Sounds.
Sounds?
Sounds. In the first place, I don't know how many people who live in a city have ever been in a place where there is total silence.
Total silence.
No sound at all. And when the wind wasn't blowing, and when the cattle weren't making noises, it was absolutely silent. You could hear an ant crawling around on the ground. Yeah. And when the wind blew, then we had these big windmills. They were the largest windmills of the type ever built, big Samson mills. And when the wind turned them, they would creak. And the wells were 800 feet deep, and the sucker rods went down the casing of the well. And as the wheel turned, the sucker rods moved up and down in the well casing to bring the water up, and they made noise. And that was the noise we accustomed to hear.
Tell me about your father.
He was wonderful, I thought. He was so intelligent, and he could do anything. He could make anything work. He could build anything. He could fix anything. And he was the veterinarian to the cattle, and he was the doctor to all of us or the cowboys if anything went wrong. We were really a long way, hundreds of miles from medical help. He was everything, and he made life fun. It was a lonely place to be in some ways, and when he would go around the ranch, he wanted company. So if I were there, he'd like me to go with him out doing whatever we had to do. And I liked to read, so I might have my nose in a book, and I wanted to finish my Nancy Drew mystery and not go running around the ranch. But he'd say, well, you need to go because I have something to show you. Well, what do you have to show me? Well, I won't tell you. You'll have to come and see. Well, how do I know it's something I want to see? I promise you, this is something you won't want to miss. So he'd get my curiosity up, and I'd go with him, and sure enough, he would have found some special thing to show me or to do that would make that trip particularly worthwhile.
Now, you and your brother see your father differently.
Yes, that was really the only place working on the book where we had to work this out. because my brother came back after the university and worked at the ranch with my father. Now, my father thought he was right about everything. And I used to have some arguments with him. I went off to Stanford, and I was studying Keynesian economics. That didn't sit well on the Lazy Bee Ranch. And I remember coming home.
Because of Keynesian theory, or?
Because of the theory. And I would remember coming home, and we'd get in these heated debates around the dinner table over Keynesian theories. And he wasn't sure at all that I was learning the right thing. But he thought he at least knew how everything should be done on the Lazy Bee Ranch. We had Hereford cattle,
right,
and he had bred them so that they would not have horns, and he had produced what he thought was a wonderful herd of cattle. And when my brother went to work there, he thought we should change to Barzona cattle. Well, you know, this was sort of difficult to work out. And my brother thought if the truck was old, we ought to get a new one. And my father didn't believe in spending money if he didn't absolutely have to. So they had a lot of tension between them. And I never experienced that. So our observations of our father were somewhat different.
And your mother?
We agreed that she was fantastic. She had been living in El Paso, and she had was living a city life, went to parties, played the piano, had a nice singing voice, had gone to the University of Arizona, had taught school for a little while. She loved nice clothes, and she enjoyed people and parties and liked to dance. And here she married this man who had absolutely nothing. And he was stuck out on this ranch, miles from anything. And the house at that time was a 4-room adobe house. It was surrounded by a screen porch, and the cowboys slept on the porch. It had no indoor plumbing. It had no running water. There was no electricity. And she was going to go out there and live on that ranch. Well, she and my father had truly fallen in love. They were really deeply in love with each other.
So she was prepared to make that sacrifice.
She did.
No
Her
parties.
parents didn't approve, and they went off and eloped and got married in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and went on to the ranch. And my grandmother's parting words to her daughter were, Ada Mae, don't ever learn to milk the cow.
Did she?
No, she never did. And she must have had a lot of good sense, because I never saw her go out on the ranch without being covered for the sun. You know, I was in the generation that thought having a suntan was the most important thing there was. And when I went to Stanford, we'd go to the beach and lie out in the sun hoping to get a tan. Well, you'd never do that today, I guess. And she knew better. She'd wear a hat, gloves, long sleeves. Yeah. And she was always very well dressed. I don't know how she managed.
John McCain preaches that message better than anyone else today.
He does. He's had some experience firsthand.
And is really strongly a strong advocate at every opportunity. What we want to know most of all is understanding this experience, how it shaped you, your attitude towards life, your attitude about important values.
Well, it surely must have done that, but I think our early
kind of rugged individualism
experiences
might
shape
be.
all of us.
Sure.
Growing up on a ranch, I think you learn to value a can-do mentality. If something goes wrong...
Can do for yourself.
Yes. You have to be able to fix it, make it work, solve the problem, go on, because you can't call anybody. And other people are very dependent on what you do, so you have to learn to be reasonably dependable, I think. And truth is very much valued. Decency, honesty, being articulate and working with words isn't much valued. And here I am trying to work with words.
In this book or in your life?
In my life, in my work.
In terms of writing opinions and
but
the like.
But that isn't the kind of thing that had much standing on the ranch life.
But you left that ranch and went to one of the great universities in the world, Stanford, as an undergraduate.
Right.
Did well, went to the law school, was editor of the Law Review.
Met my husband.
Met your husband, John O'Connor, there?
At law school.
At law school. Mm-hmm. It said that you dated Bill Rehnquist, did you?
Well, we...
We what? John?
Now, here, I'm about to tell you. We were in the same class in law school.
Yeah.
And he was a marvelous student. He was the star of the class, so that was fun to watch him in class. He really was excellent. And,
well, you weren't doing bad yourself.
Well, fair, but he was a star. And I lived at a graduate women's co-op sort of a place. It was the home of Mrs. Cubberly, whose husband had been the head of the Department of Education at Stanford, and he had died. It was a large redwood home overlooking the bay, and Mrs. Cubberly was alone in it, and she opened it to graduate women to live there, which was wonderful because there was no housing for graduate women. And so Bill Rehnquist would come up sometimes, and we'd play charades, or we'd play bridge, or we'd sometimes go to movies, and all those things. He was just kind of...
Well, but I mean, Bill, I've interviewed him twice. He's a funny, interesting man.
Yes. Has a good sense of humor. And he loves games.
Yes.
So that was a good thing to do.
But what was it growing up on the ranch that gave you this academic interest, this academic bent? Was it your mother or your father, or is it just there?
Well, probably just reading books. My parents both loved to read. And
so
my
books
mother,
had a real place at the ranch?
Oh, they did. They were my friends. I didn't have any other children around. The books were my friends.
And your view of the world?
I
suppose.
It was
almost an exposure to the world.
Yes. And anyway, reading was very important, so I think it was not unnatural to want to get an education.
So you get out of Stanford Law School. What do you want to do?
I was dying to practice law. And I thought,
This'll be
I'll
easy.
go get a job, yes.
Because I did very well in law school, so
Sure.
it'll be automatic.
Right, and there were all these notices on our bulletin board at the law school asking our class to please apply to this firm and that and have an interview because they wanted to
Okay, now just for the record, where did you stand in your class?
Stanford never officially kept a class.
Okay, but you were editor of the Law Review.
I was.
Okay, so that's pretty good. That's the highest review you can have. The highest...
Pretty good, right.
The highest achievement.
Yeah.
So you see all these ads on all saying we want the best and brightest to come work for our firm.
Yes, but I couldn't get an interview. I called
They wouldn't
them all.
even interview you.
No. And I had a friend at Stanford as an undergraduate.
This would make me a feminist so fast if I were you.
Well, it was very interesting. I had this friend, and her father was a partner in a major California law firm. And I said, ask your father why I can't get an interview at his law firm.
Yeah, what's wrong with me?
And she did. And so her father arranged for me to go down to Los Angeles for an interview. And I talked to the interviewing partner, as we're sitting here. And he chatted for a while about what I'd been doing. And then he said, well, Miss Day, how do you type? And I said, well, fair, not great, but fair. And he said, well, I could probably get you a job here as a legal secretary if you wanted. But he said, we've never hired a woman as a lawyer here, and I just don't think that we'll be doing that in the future.
And so what did you think?
Well, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, not a legal secretary.
But were you angry? I mean, were you outraged? Here you were.
I was disappointed.
Just disappointed?
Disappointed.
You had gone to law school and you were the star of your class.
But I was hearing that. I was hearing that from other law firms too, and I finally got the message. When I went around and looked, I realized none of them were hiring women lawyers. Yeah. So then I had to figure out, well, who was? And the first places that were really hiring women as lawyers were public law offices. U.S. attorney, district attorney, county attorney, some state job of some kind. And I had met John, and we were planning to get married. He was in the next class, so if we were going to get married and if we planned to eat, one of us had to work. And I thought it would be nice to work at being a lawyer. So I asked the district attorney of San Mateo County if he would consider me for a job. And it was a wonderful man. He was Louis DeMatteis, and he'd been elected as district attorney in San Mateo County. Italian-American, big Italian-American community.
What's the largest city in San Mateo County?
Well, I don't know now. The county seat was in Redwood City, and there was this beautiful old courthouse with a fabulous dome on it with stained glass. It was just wonderful. It still stands today. Yeah. And his offices were in that building, and he had once had a woman on his staff, lawyer. And I thought, well, if he could have one, he could have another. I mean, he could hire another one. So we had a big talk, and he said, well, first of all, I don't have an opening. Right. Second of all, I don't even have a place to put you. I don't have an empty office. And I said, well, you know, if need be, I'll work for you for nothing. And if you don't have a place for me to sit, I'll sit with your secretary if she'll have me. And he said, oh, well, I'll think about it. So I went back to the Lazy Bee to sort of get ready for our wedding, which was going to be at the Lazy Bee Ranch in December. 50 years ago, next December.
All right.
Yeah.
But we can't celebrate at the Lazy Bee.
No, we can't, so we're going to have to think of something else, I guess. But anyway, I wrote him a letter from the Lazy Bee and spelled out all the reasons why I thought I could be useful in his office and why he should hire me. And when I got back, he did see me, and he did say, well, we'll make do here. I've looked at the budget, and we'll pay you a little something, and you will have to share space with my secretary, but come on and go to work.
What's amazing about this to me is this, we're talking 1952, 53. 52. Uh-huh. Eisenhower's about to become president.
Right.
You can't get a job in a law firm. They won't even interview you.
No.
And you go to San Mateo County, and you've got a man who's willing to have you come in under special circumstances.
Right. But the good thing was, it was a great place to work.
Right.
And my immediate supervisor was just marvelous. He was a man named Keith Sorensen, and he was a really good lawyer. And we were doing legal work for all the various county officers and agencies and boards and commissions. And my classmates who'd gone to work for law firms were just doing drudge work, taking depositions, doing dull stuff.
Yeah, but that's small satisfaction. That's small satisfaction.
Well, no. Now, so let me tell you what happened.
All right.
So the district attorney, Louis DeMatteis, was made a judge in the county. So that slot was open, and my supervisor, Keith Sorensen, became the district attorney, and that opened up a marvelous slot, which Keith Sorensen gave me.
So Sandra Day O'Connor is on her way.
On my way. It was just wonderful.
Now, what did you think you were going to have a life in politics then, or
no, in public
life
service kind of position. Yeah. I loved it. It was really great. And most of my life, I've been in that area, not exclusively, but most of it. Then the problem was, John got drafted.
Yeah.
It was the Korean War. And I kept my job while he was at Fort Ord getting basic training. And then he got a commission in the Judge Advocate General's Corps and was sent to Charlottesville, Virginia. And we hadn't been married that long, so I thought I had to go. So I gave up this job that I adored, and off I went to Charlottesville with John, and it was very interesting because I had never been east at all. And one weekend, I said, let's go see Washington, D.C. And he said, all right, because he had traveled. He had been all over, and he'd been to Washington before.
This was your first trip east?
Yes. And so we drove to Washington, and it was in January, and it was so cold. It was snowy and freezing. And we got to the Supreme Court, because I wanted to see that, and it was closed. It was Saturday. So we walked up those magnificent marble steps, and we stood amongst the columns at the top by the big brass door. And I took a picture of John standing there in the columns. And I said, gee, this is the closest we'll ever get to the Supreme Court.
Do you think about being Chief Justice?
No, absolutely not.
I quoted my friend Walter Dellinger,
well,
saying if there's anybody who would and should be Chief Justice, it is you. You've got tenure there.
Yeah, no, but it doesn't work that way. Oh, dear. Now, most Chief Justices are drawn from off the court. You know, if you look back historically, the vast majority have come from outside the court.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
Not recent true. No, not recently.
Well, the incumbent Chief Justice was from within the court,
right,
but not his predecessor.
Well, Berger, that's right, Berger was not.
And most of them have not. And so...
That's right, Earl Warren was not.
Now, Stone was different.
Right.
He worked
Harlan
his
Stone.
way up,
Right.
yes. But most have not. And so
But
that
think
seems to
about
work
this.
well.
Now think about this for me for a second.
All right.
I want you to just think about this. 50 years ago, you can't get them to interview you.
Right.
And now you would be, if the president decides, if Rehnquist decides to retire first, and
That's
they need
a
a new,
big if.
that's a big if. Although he said to me and others that, you know, and we believe, journalists believe, you know, that he probably wants to do it when there's a Republican president. That's now. Wouldn't it be great, this sort of continuum from this brilliant graduate of Stanford Law School who couldn't get a job in a law firm, who all of a sudden, all of a sudden is the first woman Chief Justice.
No, see, that's
Having
something
been the first woman Justice, is the worst woman Chief Justice.
No, that's something the media would think was a neat arrangement, but in fact is not very sensible. I am old. Old.
So
and a president,
old means wise,
listen,
old means
no,
experienced,
well, not
old means...
necessarily, but
old means...
a sitting president acting wisely will try to place someone on the court if an opportunity arises who's not old already.
Who can serve like Rehnquist has for 20 years.
Exactly, exactly.
What were you doing when you got the call that you'd might be nominated by President Reagan as an Associate Supreme Court Justice?
I got a phone call when I was home. I had just had surgery, and I was home in bed recuperating, and the telephone rang, and it was William French Smith. He was the Attorney General of the United States.
And
I
the President's lawyer, too.
Yes, and he had been a partner in the very California law firm that had said, "How would you like to be a legal secretary?"
This is a big LA firm. Yeah. So did you remind him of that? Did you say?
Yeah, he said, I'd like to invite you to come back to Washington and talk to us about a position here. Now, I had immediately the sense that it was in connection with the Supreme Court. Justice Potter Stewart had just announced his retirement. But I said, "Oh, you must mean a secretarial position." So we had a few laughs over that.
William French Smith says, "Come to Washington, we want to talk to you about a position. It's not a secretarial position."
Right.
You know it's the Supreme Court. I mean,
yes.
You probably had been roomed, I've forgotten what it was like in the present time, but it probably you were on the list. As we know, for example, that...
He later told me that when he took the job as Attorney General, one of the first things he did was to try to start compiling a list of possible people for Supreme Court positions in case there were a vacancy during President Reagan's term. And he said he kept that list in his own hand under his telephone in his office, and that he had put my name on the list somehow. I'm not quite sure how, but it got there. Yeah. Well, I really don't.
So what happened then? You went to Washington and you were interviewed?
I had a meeting in Washington anyway. I said, I'll call my doctor and see if I can go. Yeah. And the doctor said, well, all right, if you don't carry anything. And so I went, and I had a meeting because I was on a national medical commission. Right. And so I went to that meeting, and I arranged to meet with President Reagan's advisors at a place designated by Attorney General Smith. And the first night that I arrived, the Smiths were living at the Jefferson Hotel in an apartment in the hotel, and he invited me to come and have dinner with Attorney General Smith and his wife, which I did, and that was my first chance to meet them, and they were so nice. His wife had gone to Stanford, so we had a lot of Stanford
and how
talk.
soon thereafter did they announce the appointment, the nomination?
It was about 10 days after I returned home from Washington.
Had Reagan been a political hero of yours?
I was active in Republican politics in Arizona, and I thought he was a very attractive candidate for the Republicans.
Identified with his politics and his values?
Well, one of the things he had supported in California was a provision in the California Constitution to limit the state debt to a ratio of income in the state, so that the state was not going to increase its debt year after year. And I tried to pattern a similar proposal for Arizona, which I did get passed, and I had talked to him a time or two about that proposal.
Was Barry Goldwater a political hero?
Yes, he was a very special man, and he was a neighbor of ours. We lived in the area that became Paradise Valley. It's sandwiched between Scottsdale and Phoenix. And he had a beautiful house up on the hill, and we were down on the flat land by the canal, but I could see his house from our house. And we were in the same political precinct. And so I used to carry petitions and that kind of thing.
When you arrived at the Supreme Court, how was it? What was it like for you as the first woman associate justice?
Well, it was a very intense experience, to say the least.
Intense because you felt like you had...
Of all of the attention that was being given nationwide, indeed worldwide, to the fact that finally, after 191 years, a woman had been put on the Supreme Court of the United States. And there was enormous interest in it. And it was a very difficult job, and it's hard enough to do without a lot of media attention being given to it. And frankly, you and your colleagues paid too much attention to it, I thought.
Why?
It was not comfortable.
Well, but I mean, except for the uncomfortable, because it made you uncomfortable, why shouldn't we have paid attention to it? Because it was a historic appointment.
That's fine, but then let's move on and let's let the work be done. And it didn't seem to work that way, because everywhere that Sandra went, the press was sure to go.
Sure. Yeah.
And I even had situations of being at public functions, talking to people, and all of a sudden seeing inserted in the middle of the circle of people talking a long arm with a microphone on it, inserted by some member of the press hoping to pick up conversation that was not intended to be.
Well, can you imagine what it would be like if you accept the Supreme Chief Justiceship?
Well, I mean, that was most unfortunate. And then we learned later that other people had been sifting through our trash, hoping to find things in our trash that they could
You're not the first person in Washington that's happened to.
No, but it's not pleasant.
Oh, I'm sure it's not.
No. Anyway, the work was hard, and it was just the most electrifying moment was the first time that I went in our conference room to talk about actual cases, to try to go around the table and to resolve the cases that had been argued that week.
It must be
It was hard to believe that I was seated at that table with my 8 colleagues and
Who
would
was
be
there
given
at the
an
time you were
equal
appointed?
voice. Well, Chief Justice Warren Burger, and Justice Brennan, William Brennan, Justice Thurgood Marshall, Justice Harry Blackmun, Justice Byron White.
Appointed by Jack Kennedy.
Yes, and famous football player in his day, and wonderful justice.
Wizard, they called him, from the University of Colorado.
If you called him that, you weren't his friend.
Oh, they didn't like that. He
No,
didn't like that.
He did not like that.
Yeah.
And
Because that's what they called him as a football player.
my wonderful colleague, Lewis Powell from Virginia.
Right, from Richmond.
And he was the kindest man that ever lived. And all of them said, oh, if there's any way we can help you, we're glad to, let me know. But everybody's too busy, really, and you'd feel foolish running around and saying, well, how do I do this? What do I do with cert petitions? And nobody in my office had ever worked in a Supreme Court chambers before. The secretaries hadn't, my law clerks hadn't, I hadn't. We didn't know what to do. And there's no how to do it manual.
Plus you had the additional burden of...
Well, it was very hard. So each of my clerks took 2 chambers to research and find out how they handled the paper flow. What did they do? And Lewis Powell, bless his soul, offered to let me hire his second secretary. Every justice has 2 secretaries. And his second secretary was wonderful.
Because she'd been there.
She'd been there, and she was intelligent and marvelous. And I jumped at the chance. And the minute she came, order was restored in my chambers.
What's the most exhilarating thing about being a justice? The most satisfying?
The most satisfying thing is the privilege of working at work that's worth doing. And it is. It's work that's important to all of us.
Because any case that gets to the Supreme Court has great import.
Well, it has some import at the national
Otherwise,
level.
you wouldn't grant it certiorari.
Yes, it's an important issue of federal law, or we wouldn't take it.
Right.
And it's an issue on which lower courts have differed, or we wouldn't take it normally. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part. And it's an issue in which you can usually make very good arguments on either side.
Are you influenced as a justice by what happens when you sit around the table and talk about the cases? I mean, do you listen to other justices and say...
Oh, very much so. And sometimes...
Oh, that's a good point.
Yes, sometimes one of your colleagues will bring out something or an approach that perhaps you haven't thought of and that is important to you and might cause you to say, well, I hadn't thought about what so-and-so said, but I'll look into that, and that might provide a solution. I mean, you might qualify whatever you're going to say by saying, I've just listened now to what so-and-so said, and that might be a solution as well. I'll think about it.
Have you changed your opinion on important
Yes.
issues? On what issues?
Uh-huh. Well, through the years, a number. In one instance, I had a remarkable thing happen. We had a case, and it was during the Chief Justice Berger years, and the decision coming out of the conference was 5-4, and I was given the writing assignment for the majority, and I worked on an opinion for quite a while, and I became increasingly disenchanted. And the more I worked on it...
Even though you're writing the majority?
The more I worked on it, the more I became convinced I was wrong.
Wow.
And I finally wrote a letter to the Chief Justice with copies to the conference saying, the more I've worked on it, the more I think that I have made a mistake here and that the case should be resolved the other way and it should be reassigned. And so that caused the assignment to go from the Chief Justice to the most senior Associate Justice on the other side.
How many times has that happened?
I don't know, not very often.
But more than one?
But turned around, not to me,
Yeah.
but it has happened.
Yeah.
And he turned around and assigned it back to me to write for the other side. Very unusual.
Do you like writing the opinions?
Well, it's a challenge. I like it when things go together well and when you think that you've been able to muster some compelling arguments, and when you end up with a court for a position that you think is sound. That's satisfying.
Abortion has been the most controversial thing you faced in 21 years?
Well, that probably, and the election case.
This would be Bush versus Gore. Did the court serve itself well in that decision?
I'm not the one to ask that.
I know. I'm only smiling because I know you don't like to talk about it.
I don't like to talk about cases generally.
Yeah, but that one was so controversial and so got so much attention, and some say that the court determined the election. They do say that.
Yes, some say that, right.
Was it hard? I mean, everybody there. I have one question, then I'll leave. I promise. What was it? I mean, take us there. Was it the most difficult, intense time since you've been on the court?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Was it the hardest time for you? Because you knew what was at stake.
Lots of them.
But you knew what was at stake here. The presidency was at stake.
Well, I'm not going to talk about the case because I just thought, I'd make it a practice not to talk about the case.
You understand why I have to ask?
That's fine, but I choose not to, if that's okay.
No, of course, it's fine. When you look at the future, not about specific cases, but help us understand what you think the important issues are that this country and what a lot of is going to have to face.
Well, the amazing thing about the court, if you look at its cases over a substantial period of time, is the fact that every significant issue in America ends up at the court in one aspect or another. They all get there. It's astonishing. It really is. Maybe not directly the big issue, but some related aspect of it.
It is true.
Yeah. I mean, now we see concern about terrorism, and we see new legislation to deal with it. And there's no doubt in my mind that down the road, heaven knows how many years down the road, but down the road sometime, there will be some cases in the lower courts testing the interpretation of those new laws, perhaps their constitutionality, and they'll work their way up, like everything does.
Let me make it even clearer, even more immediate. Most people believe that the issue of campaign finance reform might get to the court.
It has in the past. It wouldn't surprise me if it did again, if there are new laws, and if they're tested in court, as they may well be, then over time you will see something like that come back around.
Abortion is working its way back from a case in Ohio, I think it is, from Ohio.
Yeah. All these issues seem to surface in our courts generally, not just this one. I mean, they start in the lower courts and work their way along.
You have believed, as a matter of judicial philosophy, that if in fact a state court had given an issue full and appropriate treatment, that the United States, it wasn't necessary for the Supreme Court of the United States to hear a case.
Well, it certainly might be. Suppose the courts of one state have decided an issue of federal law this way, and the state courts in another state have decided that same issue of federal law in another way.
Right. So you got a federal question.
Of course. Right. It's a federal issue, a federal question. No, state courts are not insulated from review.
But generally, as a matter of judicial policy, of philosophy, you tend to...
No, I think
I can't put those words in your mouth, can I?
No, but what I do think is perhaps a result of my years of working in all three branches of state government is to recognize that the framers of the Constitution did leave a role for states and for local government in resolving many issues. And the Constitution that was drafted preserved the sovereignty of states for a number of purposes. And so that constitutional framework should be observed and preserved.
How have you, can you help us understand how you might have how you have changed while you've been sitting on the court in terms of an approach to
Well, I hope
law?
I've learned a few things going along. I didn't know much about many of the issues the court addresses when I came to the court. And it's a learning process. I hope that I've learned quite a bit in the years I've been there. But the remarkable thing is that we continue to get issues that send you right back to the books to do research and to learn more about it.
And how much of that research is done by the law clerks?
Oh,
and
they
how much
do
of that
a
is done
lot.
by the justice? And
They
how
do
does
a
the
lot.
justice sort of interact with the law clerks?
Meet with them every day, and they're wonderful. One of the great pleasures, really, of working at the court is the privilege of having these marvelous young lawyers who serve as our law clerks. They're really the best young lawyers in the country, and they're just a joy to be around.
And
They're
you
great.
get to select 2 each year?
4.
4?
4.
My goodness.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yes. So, and they're marvelous. They
Is there
come
any
from all across the
experience that
country.
you might have wished you'd had?
I perhaps would have been much better prepared if I'd served on a federal court somewhere along the
Right.
line, which I had not. And in the early days of the country, that was not uncommon. But these days, the usual path is to select people who've served on the Federal Court of Appeals somewhere along the line.
Most people, I assume, know this, but you don't have to be a lawyer, and you do not have to have served. You don't have to have served, obviously, as any particular thing to be a member of the Supreme Court.
Right.
What are the requirements to be a judge?
Well,
a
you
justice?
have to be a certain age, and
Is it 35?
that's about it, yes. And you have to be
good
nominated,
moral-
and you
yeah,
have
right.
to be confirmed by the Senate, and that
yeah.
can be quite a challenge, I think. If you're not a lawyer and haven't had any experience, it
You
might
probably
be
will
pretty
not
hard.
make it.
But, you know, the last justice to serve who had never gone to law school, I think, was Justice Jackson, Robert Jackson. And he was a fabulous justice. And he had a way with words that was just marvelous, admirable.
What is the biggest misconception about the Supreme Court, you think?
That everything is secret, because it isn't. You know, we have 3 branches of
interesting,
government, and the only one where the positions of everybody are always explained in full, in writing, for everybody to see, is the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get that out of Congress. You don't get that out of the White House, you know. So I think that is a misconception.
There is that. I mean, The Brethren gave us. Did you read The Brethren by Bob Woodward?
Yes.
Was that a review?
Well,
what?
it was written about a different court in a different
It
era.
was, in fact,
and
but
I
it
didn't
clearly had a lot of
especially
sources
admire it.
from inside the court.
It sounded like it,
Sure
didn't it?
did. I mean, was anything about that you thought was wrong? I mean, in terms of the court you know?
Yes,
What was
yes. Well, it just pictured a lot of inside maneuvering that I don't think takes place.
Really?
Really. And really. And the interesting, now I've served in all 3 branches
Right.
of state government, and when I was in the legislature, I was in a position to see how some legislator might say, gee, I'll support you on your bill if you'll support me on mine. That kind of thing.
Right, it happens all the time.
I have not seen one instance of anything remotely resembling that at the Supreme Court.
Justice Sandra Day O'Connor comes here to say, I have never seen a vote traded for another vote in the Supreme Court in my 21 years of sitting on that court.
Right.
No one's ever come to say, look, I'm helping you on this, please help me on this.
No.
You know, because...
No. And I think that's fantastic. It is a place where every justice really tries to do a good job with everything they get and just give it the best shot you can. And the persuasion takes place primarily at the writing stage. When you circulate an opinion draft, that's where you try to write persuasively enough that others will agree. Now, you do a little bit of it around the conference table, but we don't talk very long, and it isn't the place where you really hammer things out.
We think of the court as always having in its history, back to John Marshall, Justice Rehnquist's favorite judge. Yours? Who's your favorite in history?
The great Chief Justice, I think most people acknowledge, was John Marshall.
Right. Is he your...
There were others, but he was remarkable.
Because he gave what?
Well, he put flesh and bones on the Constitution.
Yeah.
It's a very spare document. It's this skinny little thing.
You have it in your pocketbook?
Sure, I do.
You do? Let me see
sure
your...
I do.
See your...
Now, let's
see
dig it
your
out.
Constitution.
Let's dig it out. There it is.
There it is, look.
That's a skinny little thing.
Constitution of the United States.
I mean, it's not very big, is it?
No.
And part of that are the Bill of Rights and some data in the back. It's really, I mean, just, here it is, 16 pages.
Yeah.
And John Marshall he did not sit in Philadelphia to draft it, but he fought in the Revolution, you know, with George Washington, and was in the Revolution most of the time. And he was a very congenial sort of a man, we're told. Right. And when he became Chief Justice, they'd get a case, and it would pose some fundamental issue of the meaning of the Constitution, the breadth of the Commerce Clause, or something basic. And he'd say, well, I'll be glad to try to write an opinion if you want. And they'd all say, yes, why don't you do it? So he wrote almost all the opinions for that court. He served there 33 years. And most of the time, he wrote the opinions. And so he was the one who crafted them. And he wrote in Marbury versus Madison, which we look to as a case exemplifying the notion that there is the power of judicial review of acts of Congress for constitutionality. That was so fundamental, not very clearly expressed in the Constitution. But of all the people we look to from the early days as being important in the framing of the Constitution, like Madison and Franklin and Washington, Hamilton, we better put John Marshall in there, because while he didn't write it, he interpreted it. And much of what we have today is the result of his work.
We have had in the history of the court these great intellectual battles because of the towering people. I think of between Hugo Black and Felix Frankfurter, and you go back to some amazing. Do we have that intellectual vigor on the court today?
Yes, I think you have a lot of intellectual firepower on the court today, and some remarkable decision-making, really. Yes, I think you've got a very good court.
Because this, back to, but one more time to Gore versus Bush, because a lot of people listened to that because it was immediately brought out. As you pointed out to me backstage, the court has made its opinions available on audio tape before, but it's always a long time after the decision. And this was almost immediate, the same day, in fact.
Yes.
Most people that I know think the court came out really extraordinarily well. I mean, they came out with great respect for the process of two people as advocates coming up trying to make a case, and people like you giving them a tough time trying to work your way through.
People heard the arguments and the questioning, and that's good. I'm sure that was of great interest.
How do you approach oral argument as
a lot of preparation, a lot of homework.
Yeah.
In early days of the court, we're told that some of the justices liked to go into court not having read anything, so they could just hear it for the first time.
Be spontaneous.
But that was when arguments could last a very long time. And that's not our practice today. We have limited time for oral arguments, and we do a tremendous amount of reading and preparation before the oral argument, where unless we write the opinion, we'll know as much about the case by the time we've prepared for the oral argument as we'll ever know about it. So a lot of front-end time goes into that preparation, and it should.
Do you see a lot of I mean, I think of people like Larry Tribe on constitutional issues. Do you see a lot of the same lawyers coming back because they
Well, we
made
see
it a practice
some
of being part of the
several
Supreme Court
times.
bar.
We see some who appear more than once at the court, but on the other hand, we've heard some wonderful arguments from lawyers from some small town someplace across America who've never been there before. They'll never be there again, but they know the subject, and they make a very good presentation.
Yeah, how great must that be to be standing there in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing on behalf of some case that you believe in and that you have probably followed all the way through the court, unless they've hired some appellate lawyer to handle it.
No, it's very satisfying to me to see somebody come from some outlying area and do well. And I remember a case involving Indian law, and Indian law is such an arcane thing in our field of federal law, and we had two lawyers from little towns in Montana who'd never been there before, and they'll never be there again, and they were both fabulous. It was really informative for the justices.
You're going to write another book.
Well, I probably am in the process. Yes, I think so.
Was this a satisfying experience for you? To think about your father and your mother and growing up and the silence of the ranch?
Yes, in the long run it was, because it's the only thing that we were able to salvage from it.
Yeah,
memories.
Memories, that's my point. Was it also
memories.
Painful so often? Because
somewhat, but more importantly, we salvaged memories that I hope others will be able to share and maybe derive some values from as well.
What do you regret most about your life?
Oh, not having read more than I've read. I spend all my waking hours reading, but I wish I could spend more.
And who's had the most influence on you?
Oh, I'm sure my parents.
Mother and father?
Mm-hmm. To some extent, my grandmother. I lived with her for all those school years.
And if you look at, I assume, if you look at those moments where we make important choices about our life, certainly it's choice of spouse, and you've had a long and happy marriage in which you've spoken about, but it's also choice of profession. I
decided to apply to law school because of a professor at Stanford. As an undergraduate, I took a law course offered to undergraduates, and the professor was a man named Harry Rathbun, and he was fabulous. And he just worked so hard to persuade each of us that an individual can make a difference in life, that a single individual, if you really care and exert an effort, can make a difference in what happens. And he was so persuasive, and I thought part of that was his legal training. And because of him, I applied to law school.
And made all the difference.
Made a difference in my life.
How long will you want to stay on the court?
I don't know.
Until it gets, you don't know, but I mean, what would influence your decision?
If I think I can't do the job adequately, then it's time to get off.
Have you been there when you thought justice has stayed too long?
Well, I haven't seen it, no.
Justice Thomas never speaks much in oral argument.
Not too often.
You're wonderful. You are.
What can I say? Oh, dear.
You are. We are out of time. I know you're sad about that.
Oh, very.
Please join me in thanking the very fine Justice Sandra Day O'Connor.
Thank you.